Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome to the den. Alhamdulillah, Brother Muhammad Ijab has found some time from his busy schedule to join us, inshallah.
Alhamdulillah.
The doctor's here as well, mashallah, with his moments of clarity. So I've titled this particular stream Evidence for God, because I'm constantly having atheists asking me to prove God. What's your evidence? I'm an atheist because there's a lack of belief in God because there's not enough evidence and all of this kind of thing. So I personally believe it's a smokescreen they're hiding behind. I don't think they really understand what they mean when they ask for evidence. So I think one thing we're really interested in to understand, what do we mean when we say evidence, or what do they think they mean when they say evidence? And then obviously when it comes to God, I use the word God, but usually I've used the word creator, as in the cause of everything. Because a lot of the questions they ask kind of misrepresent what we believe. So I think two things that really need to be established is, what do we mean when we say evidence, and what do we mean when we say God? And then after that, we can move into the ideas of why we believe in a creator logically.
Well, before I do that, I want to say how much of a pleasure it is for me to be with the doctor, of course, but the Stone Cold Steve Austin of the Dawah. Yes. I mean, this is when he comes to Speaker's Corner with his cap, I feel like there should be, like, you know, that old school entrance music, astaghfirullah, you know, the smashing glass. Everyone knows what's going to happen next. You know, and it's I can't believe it's been this long since we've actually had a collaboration together. It's been a long time, actually. It has been a long time. The EF Dawah. I just want to say first and foremost, we'll talk about Stone Cold. There's two police officers walking right here. Hopefully, I'm not going to stop me. I'm not driving the car anyway. Yeah, I just want to say, like, you know, the work that you guys are doing collectively as EF Dawah is really phenomenal. It's fantastic work. And for those who don't know, EF Dawah is a group, and this is why it's important to have a group behind you. It's a group of brothers, you know, including Dr. Imran, who obviously we've done something together as well on the Corona stuff, and Hamza, the Stone Cold Hamza, and Co, man. You know, they work together fantastically as a team. They've been translating stuff into different languages. You know, people, whenever I go to the Arab world, I've been to Saudi Arabia recently, they always ask me about Hamza. They say, oh, you know, everyone knows Hamza. If he goes to Egypt or Saudi Arabia, he's going to be taking selfies, this man, because people don't realize how, like, the Dawah in Speaker's Corner has been a hub, but it's actually proliferated to the Arab world. And I think, like, the number 2 or 3 demographic is the Arab world. I'm not sure about that, but it seems like it's the case. And also, like in Malaysia and stuff like that, you know, in Indonesia, the work that's been done by EF Dawah is fantastic. So I don't know if you guys have got a Patreon, if you guys have got a GoFundMe or whatever you guys have got, but I, you know, encourage everybody to fund this Dawah, because the style that you guys have working together as a team, and the proficiency and the efficiency, and, you know, it's about character at the end of the day. There's not many people that can represent Islam firmly, you know, and do so convincingly and instill confidence into the hearts of the people. And Hamza's done that, and you know, I feel like I think we need to see more of you in the park that will calm people down a little bit now, because when big figures like Stone Cold are not there, then you know, then the rest of these clowns can come and play around. But yeah, no, I'm actually always like, whenever I see Hamza, I feel, yes, we've got the cavalry there, we've got the people there, you know. And I always feel like, yes, the backup is there, especially not just Hamza, but the entire team, that when they go together. And people, when they see Dr. Imran, they don't realize he's a professional doctor. He's a medic. He's a very intelligent medic who's now, you know, into the Dawah as well. So, and helping and servicing the community. So all of you, mashallah, I just want to start this. It wouldn't be right for me to come on Hamza's den and not start with this.
Oh, Jazakallah khair, bro. Yeah, no, it's amazing. It is amazing how the Dawah has spread internationally. You know, like we went on Umrah last January, And subhanAllah,
Yes.
we're at Masjid Nabawi, and we got the students from Medina University come, brother Hamza, oh, you have dawah,
Subhanallah. Yeah.
taking photos,
I
taking
told
stuff.
you. I told you. Yeah.
And we're like,
Yeah.
subhanAllah, you're the scholars of tomorrow, man. They're like, no, we love your stuff. So yeah, no, and then we've heard in Indonesia that in some villages they have kind of screens watching the video.
Allah.
It's
It's beautiful,
amazing,
man.
subhanAllah.
It's absolutely amazing. And it's an opportunity like that not many people have, Speaker's Corner. And I reckon that when people talk about Speaker's Corner in a negative sense, I always like to bring EF Dawah and your efforts, and also the SC Dawah as well, and their efforts and the brothers as an example of actually where it's going really well. Where it's going really well. And no one can say that with the tens of, not even tens, probably hundreds of millions now, I don't know, of views of people across the world that have been now exposed to the message of Islam through your videos, that is not good for Muslims and for Islam and for spreading Islam, for keeping people on Islam, and all of the rest of it. There's very a weak argument to be made if we're going to use that example, and that's why it's always good to have, like, it's a professional setup, man. It really is.
Yeah, and we're missing the park, to be honest with you. We are missing that because
what's happening with that, anyways? Why are you not coming to the park? What's going on?
For me, and I'm sure for the doctor and for Brother Abbas, it's all about the COVID. Because if you see the events of the park, what's going on there, I'm happy I'm not there.
I thought that this week as well. When I saw what happened.
Yeah, there's no social distancing. There's no, people mask down around their faces, and they're shouting at each other. And I'm thinking, do you guys not think this COVID exists or something? So right now,
if Boston came down, the Dawah, they'd all spread themselves. Believe me.
No, but I do miss it. I do miss that rough and tumble. We tried to bring it a little bit to these streams, but it's not the same thing. Because when you're in the park, it's just roll your sleeves up. What's coming? You don't know if it's an Islamophobe, is it a Christian, is it an atheist? You don't know what I mean. And it's quite exhilarating. The adrenaline's going. Alhamdulillah.
100%. And if the adrenaline is going for you, it's likely to be going for the people that are watching it as well. And this is what I think is real. It's the cutting edge, really, because when you're in front of a board, there's a place for that, whiteboard, a chalkboard, whatever you want, PowerPoint screen. There is a place for that. But when you're doing that, the average 15, 16, 17-year-old, the average man, woman, teenager watching YouTube is not going to be tuning in for a long time, and they're not going to be interested.
Yeah, they want to see the rough and tumble. I know, so it's amazing. SubhanAllah.
But yeah, going back to the questions that you asked, I think it's really important. These are two good starting points with an atheist or an agnostic or an irreligious person, because I think the standard of truth is where I always start in terms of personally when I speak to atheists. It's all about the standard of truth. Because, and this is a branch of philosophy called epistemology. So how do you know things? How do you know how do you make sense of the world? Basically, this is making sense of the world is epistemology. Like, how do you get to know the study of knowledge? How do you get to know things, or the science of knowledge? And so, what ways can we come to a conclusion about something? And the first thing is, we got to determine what the atheist standards are. If they're an empiricist, or if they just believe that, well, I won't believe in anything except if I see it or hear it or smell it or something to do with the five senses, which is basically the Quranic. In the Quran, it says, "لَن نُؤْمِنَ لَكَ حَتَّى نَرَى اللَّهَ جَهْرًا." We're not going. They said to Moses, "We're not going to believe in you except if we see Allah clearly." So this is actually an ancient empiricism. And it continues to this day, like the idea of we won't believe it until we see it. It's very easy to show the weakness of that argument, because there's many things that we know which we don't see. Either we know it through testimony, or we know it through rational argumentation, logical rules, mathematical rules, or something which doesn't strictly or even at all come under the purview of empiricism. And in fact, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, there was a school of thought in philosophy called verificationism. And it was spearheaded by this guy called A.J. Ayer and others, in Europe. And those guys were basically saying that if something they were empiricists, so they believed in that it had to go through the five senses. Anything outside of the five senses was basically a meaningless statement.
Okay.
And so the problem with this is that even this idea of if something that is outside of the five senses is a meaningless statement, that idea in and of itself is not empirically justifiable, right? So people, you can even check it out online. Go on YouTube and say AJ Ayer, probably one of the, if not the foremost philosopher that was pro-positivist and pro-verificationist. He wrote a very famous book that almost every philosophy student must have heard of. And he says, like, you know, this whole school, he's smoking a pipe, he's speaking to someone, I can't remember, Brian Mabby. It's online, you can see it. It's in the 50s. I think it must have been filmed in the 70s or something like that. And he says that, you know, our theory of positivism or this verificationist principle, it fell apart because there were so many things that we couldn't prove using the empirical method. And so positivism and verificationism, that was very popular in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and so on, it practically collapsed upon itself in the philosophical world, or in the world, in the academic world in the West. And what took its place in the early, let's say, 80s, 90s, is falsificationism. And actually, this has implications with the philosophy of science, because Karl Popper, who died, I believe, in 1997, I think it was 97, and he was actually he was a professor in the London School of Economics. He had a transformative effect on the philosophy of science, and most particularly, he kind of revised, if you like, the principle of verificationism, which was predicated on a hard empiricism, to falsificationism. So this idea that so science is not premised on verificationism anymore. It's premised on this idea that Popper put forward, which is falsification. Which is why when a scientist puts something out there, and they go to the laboratory or whatever, and they say these are my findings, it can be a scientific fact, but that's a scientific fact waiting to be disproved. No one can be really dogmatic enough with their studies to say, well, this will never be disproved, unless they're talking about something which is observable. But otherwise, if we're talking about something which has inductive implications, it's almost impossible for them to say, well, this will never change. So falsification kind of took hold. But so the point is empiricism, the idea that the five senses are the only things which govern true knowledge, is something that even within the academy, and you know, has been thrown away into the dustbins of history. And even those foremost proponents of it kind of threw it away as well. So if we hear that from atheists, I think they should just kind of see the last century, how it's gone, and how the discussion has kind of shifted from this in the academy, and they'll realize that actually this is a very weak position, extremely weak position, the hard empirical position, that the only true knowledge is that knowledge which is you know, verified through the five senses. Because how would you then make sense of that? How could you even prove that on empirically? So I think that, so really there's many routes to truth. There's mathematical routes, there's logical routes, there's intuitive routes, and so on and so forth. And I feel like the first thing to do with an atheist is to get them to admit to that point, because then we can start presenting arguments to them. Then we can start talking to them about, okay, well, do you accept A, B, and C? And then it can start becoming fruitful. But if they want to become ultra skeptical when it comes to their standards of truth, because they know that discussion is going to be about theology maybe, or the purpose of life, and really they want to move away from, they want to circumnavigate away from those discourses, then you're going to have a hard time, I think, from the very beginning.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think understanding what their standards of evidence is, because, I mean, I was reading the other day that a strong argumentation can be presented as evidence if it can't be refuted. Is that true? Is that something that could be used? Strong argument?
Yeah, and the thing is about arguments is that really there's different ways of presenting an argument, right? So in philosophy, there's inductive methods, deductive methods, abductive methods. These are the kind of three main methods that philosophers use. But let's say we use deduction. So I'll give you an easy deduction, which is used in the books of logic. Like if you say every man is mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, right?
Right.
So this is an easy, but then anyone can say, well, Socrates is not a man, for example. They can question one of the premises. So there's a difference now between valid argumentation and sound argumentation. So within deduction, you can easily make a valid argument, but the question will always be, is it sound? And for it to be sound, it has to kind of meet the criteria of every premise being true. And by any point, someone can say, well, the premise is not true, therefore the argument is unsound. It could be valid, but it's unsound. For example, an example of a valid argument but it's not sound is if I say if I just say every unicorn is white, Polly is a unicorn, therefore Polly is white. This is a valid argumentation. It's consistent, but it's not sound in the sense that we can't prove that Polly exists in the real world. So now the question is, when we're making the argument, and this is where the atheist will always kind of try and hedge his bets, say, okay, you make a valid argument, but you don't make a sound argument. It's important when you're making those arguments to get the atheist to agree at each stage. And so, for example, I'm not going to present this because it's been done so many times, especially by people like William Lane Craig. If you say everything that begins to exist has a cause, for example, and the atheist says, do you agree that everything that begins to exist has a cause? And the person says yes. And do you agree that the universe began to exist? And the person says yes. Then actually, if you agree to A and B, you have to agree to C. Now, the universe has a cause, right? Now, what the atheists will sometimes do is they'll question premise A and question premise B. So they'll say, well, I don't believe that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Or more likely, they'll say the universe does not begin to exist. So they believe in the eternal universe or something like it. Or they'll say that you're begging the question. Or they'll make anything up, right? Or that there's this fallacy here or that fallacy here, or that the universe, the composition fallacy. They'll try and wedge in a fallacy somewhere. But the point is, if you agree with A and B, you have to agree with C. So if we can. If the atheist decides, okay, I want to use deduction, and you say, okay, you're going to use deduction, then what you have to do when you're discussing with them is you're going to have to use deduction step by step and get them to agree to each premise, because you don't want them at the end of it to say, well, I agree with the validity of your syllogism, but I don't agree with the soundness of it, because it's kind of like wasting your time. So if you get them to agree with premise 1 and premise 2, then premise 3 is natural. It has to be the case. If A and B are true, then C has to be true. So that's an example of a deductive type of argument. An example of an inductive argument is if we say, well, there's 100 swans, they're all white, therefore all swans are white. So that's a full-on, fully fledged generalization. Problem with induction is that can you say that all swans are white because 100 of them are white? There could be a black swan. And this is the problem that science suffers from, because when people make studies now, scientific studies, they are confined to the number of participants in that study group. So if they have 100 participants, 1,000, and obviously the bigger the better, for the most part, the bigger the better. But you can't say it's completely generalizable, because there's this chance that someone's going to make a bigger study and falsify, going back to falsification, your theory. So there's always going to be limits to how you use arguments, whether it's abductive. And abductive is really the inference to the best explanation. So we see phenomena in a certain way, and we say, okay, well, what explains this? You have theory 1, 2, and 3. Theory 1 explains it best. For example, I left dog food for my dog at home, and I don't have a dog. I'm just making this as an example. And then when I came back, the bowl was empty. So my inference to the best explanation that the dog ate the dog food. Yeah, I don't have anyone else at home that would eat it. I don't have any other dogs. That's my inference of it. And I'd be happy living my life knowing that the dog ate that food, or my cat, or the goldfish, or whatever animal you want to put in this equation. But so once again, for me, it satisfies my kind of skeptical need. But for other people, they say, well, actually, it could be the grandma that she not opened the door, she has a key, and she ate the dog food from the bowl. And the level of skepticism will start to rise when the stakes start to become higher for the atheist. So although you have three, you have, abduction, you have deduction, you have induction. All of them suffer from limitations. And if we're being honest, every single one of them, everything suffers. I mean, you can doubt almost anything. I mean, the most fundamental phrase that was almost uttered in all of philosophy, which is cogito ergo sum, uttered by Descartes. I think, therefore I am. He went through a whole skeptical, he has a book called The Meditations, and he went through a whole skeptical episode, and I think it's 6 chapters, and he says, I doubt my senses, I doubt this, and I doubt that. And then at the end, he says, there's one thing I don't doubt. I think, therefore I am. And then this kind of laid the foundation for everything else. And so if this lays the foundation for everything else, I think, therefore I am, then you think, okay, no one's going to come after and be able to poke holes at this. But actually Nietzsche comes out, when you say I, you're presupposing, that you exist when you say I think. And others said, well, actually, you're presupposing language as well when you say I think, therefore I am, because you're using language in order to communicate that. Syntactically, you're using language. So even the most and this is a branch of logical or philosophical foundationism, or rational, foundationalism, where really you think there's nothing. You've hit rock bottom, but actually even then you can start poking holes. But the truth is, no one lives like that. We live probabilistically. We live on basis of, okay, I'm here now. I'm in a car right now. Could I be in a spaceship? I mean, if we wanted to exhaust all possibilities, it's possible that I'm asleep now and I'm on a spaceship in my dream. That's possible. But I'm willing to bet that I'm not like that. That's not the case. Why? Because I've experienced this before, because of a range of probabilistic factors that I experience, and I'm willing to risk whatever it is I'm going to risk to believe that I'm actually in my car, not asleep, and so on and so forth. So these are the matters. I mean, if you want to be skeptical, we can always be very skeptical, right? You can even be skeptical with your skepticism, and it becomes infinitely regressive. But if you'll see the sincerity of an atheist or an agnostic or whatever it is, if they are willing to employ the same level of skepticism they do on a day-to-day life with the conversation about the purpose of life and the ultimate origins and so on and so on. If they don't do that, then really I would say, unless you're doing it for video purposes, like if you're making a video and showing the absurdity of this person's argument, I would say this person's actually a waste of time. I'd still present the arguments, but I actually do think if they say, well, what about this, and they give you some ridiculous examples, say, okay, maybe more interesting, and then I just kind of leave the scene, because
honestly, listen, we've had atheists on here saying they don't use a regular doctor if they've not checked out that he's a doctor, or just to challenge a narrative, or they won't use a particular gadget unless they know how it works. Because the idea, because I always say to them, look, you believe many things in your day-to-day life that you don't verify. Exactly. But they actually claim that they do verify these things, and that's where it goes absurd.
I mean, it's embarrassing when they say that, because the whole of science now, like when we study science in school and beyond, we study it through textbooks. Now, no one's going to go and recreate, 1,000 experiments. If we know 1,000 scientific facts, which I'm sure a lot of us, especially the Dr. Imran, maybe he knows 10,000 or 100,000. For us laymen, we have maybe 100, something like this. But for all scientific facts that I've learned, and I'm sure the doctor as well, right? He hasn't gone into the laboratory, putting on the lab coat and getting the same numbers of participants and so on, and kind of say, oh, you prescribe, whatever it is you prescribe to your patients, but you haven't actually seen its effect in the laboratory. You actually depend upon the testimony of those people that peer-reviewed whatever it is drug.
100%, yeah, 100%.
Right, it has to be like that. Otherwise, it's absurd. And so if they're trying to eliminate this testimony, then it's ridiculous. Then we can start denying the Holocaust and stuff like that. We can start denying everything, really. We can start denying historical facts. We can start denying World War One actually happened. But they don't live their lives like that. And so if they have any kind of discussion, they're not going to do so on the pretense that, or these things didn't happen. So at the end of the day, I feel a lot of these atheists are just deceived. It's self-delusion. Is to really know the sincere one from the insincere one is when you start to probe their expectations on this point. I think that's where the starting point should be. If you have a friend who's, to be honest, I was working maybe about 8 years ago. Now I was about 19 years old, right, man? 10 years ago, yeah. So about 10 years ago, I was working in the city. And I had a manager. I'm not going to mention his name. He's a manager. And I was selling land at a time. I was a land broker. I was selling land, and the guy, he was a vehement atheist, and I would try and give him dawah, and so on. And this was before, obviously, YouTube generation, all that. I was giving him dawah, and giving the rest of the team in the office. I was giving them all dawah, and then one day, something happened to him, and he started like calling for God and stuff. And I said to him, "Well, I thought you were an atheist." And he genuinely said, "Look, when I said to him, when you're in need, do you do this regularly? Like when you're in need, you call for God?" He said, "Yeah." And I just thought, so, but you were just debating me on the in lunchtime, saying how ridiculous it was for God to exist. But it's like your psychological disposition changes when your life changes, and that's what the Quran says. A lot of these individuals, when they go and they have like a life-altering situation, they're on the sea or something like that, and something bad happens to them, they cry to God. When they come back to the shore, they go back to polytheism, or in this case atheism. And so the problem, I think this is I would call this the fundamental problem with discussions of atheists, that they have different standards for different discourses. This is what, like, honestly, my experience has told me, speaking to dozens, if not hundreds of atheists throughout the years. They have different standards for different discourses, but all discourses are actually the same kind of thing. And I'm not saying, by the way, the evidentiary bar should be the same in all discourses, but what I'm saying is, why do you raise the evidentiary bar to an impossible standard when you talk about God? Like, in this country, we have like courts, right? So we have civil courts and you have criminal courts. And for the civil courts, they say on the basis of probability. They actually use that language. They say on the basis of probability, this is what happened, and that's enough to get, because that's why in this kind, it's quite clever, right? Criminal convictions, they say beyond reasonable doubt. They say beyond reasonable doubt. Obviously, there's a large degree of subjectivity there. But all they're saying is that we just need more evidence. We need the cumulative case to be more. But what the atheists are effectively saying is that we are not accepting, well, not all of them, but in these cases, we're not accepting on base of probability, and we're not even accepting beyond reasonable doubt. We're not accepting any of this. We're going to continue being skeptical at every stage. And I feel like that is the fundamental point. If that is the case, then we'll have to wait and see, when we die, what's going to happen. That's all I can. If I were literally not being filmed or something, and I feel like, because when I'm being filmed, like I'm sure you do as well, we see people, we talk through them, because after a while you think this guy's antagonistic, he's hostile. We don't care about, like, sorry to say, we do care about you, but we care more about the people that are watching now, because at this stage we just want to see the absurdity. We want them to see the absurdity of what you're saying. We want to really demolish your arguments. But if I was on day to day and I'm at work and there's a colleague who just keeps being, it's a waste of time to engage with them, really, I would say.
Yeah.
If they keep being ultra skeptical and whatever, just say, okay, well, to you, your religion, and to me, whatever religion that may be, or to you, your way, and me, my way, and let's find out until when we die.
Let me just add one thing to that. Can I just add one thing to that, and then let Imran speak. You see, when I'm speaking to atheists, to be honest with you, I'm not really trying to convince them to believe in a creator.
Yeah.
All I'm trying to demonstrate to them is that my belief in a creator is rational, reasonable, and logical. I don't care whether they accept it or not, to be honest with you. It's just that I want to make sure my position that I'm holding is a solid, reasonable position. You know what I mean? If they're going to be skeptical and they're going to don't even acknowledge they exist and all this kind of stuff, that's got nothing to do with what I believe. Do you get me? So, and I think this is what will lead us on to why. So the idea of God, when we see God, you know, I don't like using the word God. I'll be honest with you. You know, when I speak to an atheist, they use the word more than I do. I try not to mention it at all. Yeah. I put God in the title of this though, to bait the atheists into the room. Yeah. Because they need to, because they're always asking for this evidence. So, like I say, this will lead us on to what do we, when we say God or Creator or Allah, what are we referring to? Because they have this kind of Christology style, old man in the clouds. That's why they go on about sky wizard and all this kind of business. I think it's interesting to demonstrate what we actually believe when we say a creator or God. What we're referring to.
As Muslims, what we believe is obviously how our idea of Allah, the creator, the ultimate creator, basically describes himself. But I like to differentiate between, when we're talking to atheists, I don't introduce them to the mercy of God. I don't introduce them to the love of God. I don't introduce them to a lot of the attributes, the forgiveness or the forgiving nature of God, because these things, for the most part, I'll agree that if you are going to make an argument from first principles, it's going to be very tenuous. It's going to be difficult to prove those particular attributes, or it's going to be way more difficult than proving, for example, oneness and omnipotence and will and necessity and so on. And so, for the purposes of discussing it with an atheist, what we're talking about is the ultimate cause. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about basically the thing which, and it's okay to call God a thing because he calls himself that in the Quran. قُلْ أَيُّ شَيْءٍ أَكْبَرُ الشَّهَادَةِ قُلِ اللَّهُ. What thing is the best in testimony? Say Allah. This is so the entity, okay, the entity that basically breaks the infinite regress of dependent things and breaks the infinite regress of causes. We're talking about something which, if it didn't exist, an absurdity would exist. Either an absurdity of causes or infinite regress of causes, that is an absurdity by the standards of almost all philosophers throughout the ages, or an absurdity of an infinite regress of dependent things. So we're talking about an entity which allows us to make sense of the world without contradiction, without the contradiction of an infinite regress of causes or an infinite regress of dependent things. We're talking about the eternal thing which everything depends upon, and it depends upon nothing. And how we come to that conclusion requires argumentation. I would make that postulation just abstractly. I'd require space to obviously articulate why it is the case that you can't have an infinite regress of causes or infinite regress of dependent things. But basically, when we're talking about God on a basic level, we're basically talking about, from the Islamic perspective, what Surah Al-Ikhlas refers to, which is Qul huwallahu ahad, say he's God one and only. So it's one God without a second, right? Or a third or a fourth. Allahu Samad, the entity which everything depends upon and it depends upon everything. They translate as the sovereign, but this Samadiyya is basically this idea that everything depends upon it, where it depends upon nothing. That is what's, for me, Yasmudu ilayhi al-ashya. Tasmudu ilayhi al-ashya, that everything depends upon it and it depends upon nothing. That's what Samad is. Lam yalid wa lam yulad is he begets not, nor is he begotten. But as a lot of the commentators say, that indicates pre-eternality and post-eternality as well. So we're talking about the one eternal thing which everything depends upon, and it depends upon nothing. That's what we're talking about on the base level. And I think that the moment, all I'm trying to do with an atheist is get them to believe in that. If they believe in that, then they've left their atheism. And then stage two would be Quranic arguments, would be prophetic arguments, and with that comes all the rest of the attributes and so on. Because I don't think so many of the attributes can be proven from first principles. It is actually textual.
Imran, do you want to?
So I think Jazakallah khair, that's really good laying out. So in going right back to the epistemology of people, talking to atheists and establishing with them sort of routes to knowledge. One of the things that you find is that even though they may accept argumentation as a valid mechanism of attaining knowledge, they seem to give it less weight than other types of evidence. So they almost don't think it's as valuable as a method of attaining knowledge. And when it comes to this, the skepticism that we see when it comes to discussing God, they often, you get this catchphrase which is sort of well known, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Yeah.
So I think the thing that comes to mind is for those people who would say that, or who would feel that maybe logical argumentation or philosophical argumentation isn't a valid way or as valid a way as other ways, and usually they're referring to materialistic ways or instrumentalism or something like this. Those are the argumentation isn't as valid as other ways of attaining knowledge. How would you approach to sort of trying to show that yes they are, and how then this question of, is the claim for the existence of this necessary being an extraordinary claim? And I've often argued that it isn't, but I was wondering what your perspective might be.
Well, I think that this point of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is itself a claim which requires evidence, right? So because they've done two things here which are bypasses. I would call them bypasses. Is that they have they've made a claim without evidence, which contradicts their first point, which extraordinary. Because I'll say, what's your evidence that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? And for the most part, they can't produce empirical evidence for that claim. In fact, it's impossible for them to produce, going back to empiricism, empirical evidence for the claim that. And this, I think, was from Christopher Hitchens. Remarkable claims come from. Yeah, I mean, that's the first issue. The second issue is labeling it as an extraordinary claim. Because what's the evidence that this? Because in the world of epistemology, right, all claims are equal. I mean, if we're not talking about the arguments from probability, because I understand that obviously in that world things are different. But I'm talking about, because when you use the word extraordinary, what do you actually mean? Why is it extraordinary? Like, on what basis is something extraordinary to something not being extraordinary? There's no scientific method, if you like, or mathematical method, or even logical method of distinguishing extraordinary claims from non-extraordinary. Therefore, the language that's being used is not scientific language, it's not logical language, and I don't even think it's neutral language. It's basically it's a type of language, a hyperbolized, exaggerated type of language, intended only to depict the far-fetchedness of particular religious discourses, which doesn't have it. It was really a weightless kind of claim. So when we talk about types of claim, so if we're talking about mathematical claims or logical claims, I know what you're talking about, you know what I'm talking about. But the moment you start saying extraordinary claims, you're employing a great level of subjectivity into that discourse now. Because for me, what's an extraordinary claim is different to what's an extraordinary claim for you. So I would start by saying this type of language gets us nowhere, because you're using subjective value judgment to label something as extraordinary, when in fact there's nothing scientific about making one set of claims extraordinary versus another set of claims, which you might find, like for some, like Nietzsche, for example. Going back to Nietzsche, he wrote a book called Beyond Good and Evil. Okay, and for him, he was a high critic of science and the scientific method. But when he had like a mental breakdown, and this is why I say a lot of these guys are just, when it comes to standards, they have double standards. They don't live their life based on their principles. When it came to his mental breakdown, and before he died, he went to a doctor. But what happened to his philosophizing of the point that, you know, science is so corrigible to the point of being almost extraordinary to believe in? That high level skepticism really didn't materialize in his day-to-day. Therefore, I would start by saying this language, this is how easily to talk in cross purposes when you use subjective value judgments rather than measurable or specific type of language. So if I say, for example, mathematical claims require mathematical evidence. I think that's a very clear what I'm saying. If I want to prove how 2 + 2 = 4, or if I want to prove quadratic expressions, I'm going to do so using mathematics. I'm not going to do so using, physics. Although physics depends on. I'm not going to do so using, I don't know, biology or something. It's not this. It's not the same category. It would be a category mistake, a fallacy.
Yeah.
But where you can't, basically, this is how we summarize this kind of this objection. Where you can't determine a category mistake fallacy, okay, if I don't speak in the same category terms, then what you're saying is basically subjective, and is something which, so in other words, if I say mathematical claims require mathematical evidence, if you use something else to try and determine mathematical evidences, I'll say you're doing a category mistake fallacy. If you're saying extraordinary, but extraordinary is, this is not a category of extraordinary things. And if it were to be a universal transcendental category, it would have to be subjectively assessed. In logical terms, it's not a set that underneath it has constituent parts, because a set is defined as something with 0 or more than one member, right? So it's not a set or a category universal that underneath it there's so many things. It doesn't fall within that purview. For that reason, this language has to be identified as totally subjective, and basically allows us to speak cross purposes and gets us nowhere in discussion. That's why I would basically start by saying, and yeah, I'll agree with you in saying that it's, for us, it wouldn't be like, if we want to talk subjectively, for me, it's not an extraordinary claim. But you say, yes, it is an extraordinary claim, and then we can both speak subjectively, but there's no measurable way of coming to a conclusion here.
Yeah. And it's funny that when an atheist actually says those words, he thinks it's a mic drop moment.
Yeah.
He's watched it on a YouTube clip somewhere. I think one guy just said it, didn't he, in some kind of conversation, I think, if I'm not wrong.
I think it's Christopher Hitchens was like a sophist, a proper sophist, but he beat most people in his debates because of his ability to outwit them and outcharm them. Rhetorical skills were good, yeah, rhetorical skills as well. But really, if you transcribe what he said and what his opponent said, I think that you'll realize his opponents probably won him and beat him in most debates. But if you watch it, you'll think he's beating everyone.
Okay, well, yeah, that's the softest way, isn't it? Okay, so we've touched on the argument for contingency. So, how would we demonstrate to atheists that our belief in an uncaused cause of all that exists is a rational belief to hold?
Yeah, so this is what I would say.
I usually use the kalam. I'll be honest with you. You know, everything begins to exist requires a cause.
Yeah, I usually use that. That's good. I think that works. The only thing is that a lot of people, like nowadays, have started to question premise 2, and it becomes a long discussion. If they don't question premise 2, then no problem, which is everything begins to exist as opposed to the universe began to exist. If they don't say the universe is eternal or this and that, which, I mean, for all intents and purposes, they can say that. It won't stunt this discussion, and you can just say, well, the universe, therefore the universe has a cause, and then you can proceed to talk about infinite regresses and so on. But the reason why I use contingency, personally, I prefer it, is it's a bit longer to make the argument in the first instance, but the counters to it are much less. Whereas the Kalam cosmological argument can be made in 3 minutes, but the counters to it are much more. And I prefer, I mean, you can decide to have a long introductory stage and then, you know, a shorter subsequent stage, or vice versa. For me, I just prefer putting everything out there so that when they come to try and refute it, there's literally almost nothing that they can say, because what they usually do with the kalam is that they'll question causation. Okay, they'll question, or they'll question the universe began to exist. These are the two major things that they'll do with it. Whereas with the contingency argument, I don't need causation for the contingency argument to be made. So when I make the contingency argument, I'm just saying that so all I'm saying is that, you know, they cannot be, I'm going to try and summarize this in the shortest possible time. There cannot be an infinite regress of dependent things. That is a logical impossibility. So, for example, the phone that I'm using now to film this, it depends upon something else, and that the charge depends upon something else, and that depends upon something else. And when we talk about dependence, we'll talk about relies upon something else in order for it to exist. So the category here is existence. So if we're talking about category, the category is existence, and we're saying that, okay, my phone exists. Everyone agrees. If you're an empiricist, you'd agree. If you're not an empiricist, you'd still agree. If you're a dualist or an idealist, whatever it is you are, unless you want to be an extreme skeptic and say, I don't exist, the phone doesn't exist, in which case, if you're such an extreme skeptic, would say, then is that claim that you're making, is that a true claim? And then it'll be a problem for that individual. But that's a different discussion. The point is there cannot be an infinite regress of things depending upon other things ad infinitum. Because then the question is, what does it all depend upon to exist? If this phone depends upon something else, and this something else depends upon something else, and that something else depends upon something else, in order to exist, and in order to exist should be highlighted here, then it has to ultimately have something which everything depends upon, and it depends upon nothing. Otherwise, you would have an infinite regress of dependent things. So think of it like dominoes falling upon each other. If you have dominoes knocking upon each other, then that image there should show you that, okay, one dependent domino knocks another dependent domino, knocks another dependent domino, knocks another, and if they're all falling, that shows you that they're all dependent, and therefore they cannot all stand still, stand high, without there being some kind of foundation that they will lean upon. Likewise, if you go to the sea, right, you don't have to see that the sea floor, you don't have to see the sea floor to realize that the sea is basically being lifted by something. Because you know the nature of water, it falls, right? So we know that water is, especially in the gravitational world that we live in, if water falls and you go to the sea and the sea doesn't have a sea floor, then what is it basically being balanced upon? So you'd conclude there's a sea floor, even though you haven't seen it. So we're saying that the world and existence works in an analogous way. And that's why Allah's, actually, from an Islamic perspective, is called the Qayyum. And the Qayyum comes from Qama Yaqumu, that's why Qad Qamat as-Salah, which literally means stand for prayer, because he's making everything stand. Literally, that's because everything depends on him in order to exist, and he depends upon nothing. That is one of the words, and Samad is very similar to the word Qayyum in that sense. So from those angles, we're saying logically, how do you explain? This would be the question I always ask them. How can you explain a world with only things that depend upon other things that depend upon other things ad infinitum? In order to maintain a position that is the case, you'd have to explain how that is the case. How could it be that things depend upon, in order to exist, other things that depend upon other things ad infinitum? If they say, no, we don't believe that, we do believe that there is something that everything depends upon, and it depends upon nothing, then we've reached the point of Surah Al-Ikhlas, which is basically, that's what we're, the khalas. I believe now, atheism, it's impossible to believe in atheism and believe in that at the same time. You've at least reached a point of deism. Now atheism has gone out the window. You're at least a deist at this point.
Yeah, I would agree.
So I think it's a very powerful argument. So one of the things that helps people to maybe understand a little bit more is this thing, we're using the term contingent and incontingent. So how would an individual, if they're trying to assess this for themselves, know the difference between something that is contingent and something that is not contingent? How would they be able to differentiate the two things? Because in our experience, we don't know of a incontingent thing in our experience, apart from the creator, because this is the argument that's being made. So how does a person differentiate between something that's incontingent and something that isn't? What are the ways of doing that?
All right, philosophically, Avicenna, who's Ibn Sina, right? He says this. He says, and obviously we don't agree with all of his views, and I don't want to go into this, but I just look at philosophical arguments. We try and filter those things which are theologically fine and those which are not. But he says basically something which is contingent is something which can be taken out of creation and no absurdity would occur. Something which can be taken out of the world and no absurdity would occur. That's the definition. But also something which depends upon something else in order to exist. Those two things. So something which depends upon something else. So for example, the human being. The human being. And by the way, Allah says that in the Quran. Were they created from nothing, or are they themselves that created themselves? In other words, without my parents, I couldn't be here. They were an effective cause for me. So I was contingent upon my parents, and they're contingent upon their parents. That's something which is observable, right? So observably, we can see that, okay, there's contingency there. But also, if I were to be taken out of this world, just as there was a time that I wasn't in this world, no absurdity would occur.
Yeah.
When we're talking about absurdities, this is to be in contradistinction to impossibilities. So a contingent thing is demarcated from a impossible thing, because an impossible thing cannot be in the world. A squared circle cannot actually be in the world. So the category of impossible things has no members, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
If you want to describe it in set terms, it has no members. Whereas the category of contingent things has a finite amount of members, and that set or that category encompasses everything which, in order for it to exist, requires something else, either preceding it it doesn't have to be time, or for it to be required for it. So it doesn't have to be proceeding in time format, but it just has to. Without it, it wouldn't be, basically. Without X, Y wouldn't be.
Right.
And that basically that formula can be expressed for almost everything observable, basically. Everything observable, everything tangible, everything within the world fits the formula. Without X, Y wouldn't be.
Okay.
And so just to summarize, so basically if something could not have existed without affecting anything, that thing is contingent. And the other thing that you mentioned is that if it's clearly requiring something else for it to be as it is.
The first thing was, so to be taken out of creation, no absurdity would exist.
Yeah.
So creation would not collapse upon itself. There would be no impossibilities that would exist, contradictions or logical impossibilities. Basically that. So, for example, let me give you a trivial, maybe not trivial, but maybe an example that will help understand the law of non-contradiction. Whether you want to believe it empirically or in a Platonic way or whatever. If that law itself didn't exist, then contradictions would exist. So the law has to exist. So if you remove it, then there'll be contradictions. And that's why in the category of facts, okay, the law of non-contradiction is axiomatic and it's also necessary.
Yeah.
Just like 2 + 2 = 4 is a necessary fact. But that's the category here is facts.
Yeah.
And what we're talking about with the creator is the category of existence. So in the category of existence, if you take the necessary existence out, then everything else doesn't make sense. Everything else would collapse, basically. Whereas in the category of facts, there's so many examples of facts that if you take them out, contradictions would occur. But what's more foundational, facts or existence? We would say existence is more foundational, because without existence, there could be no facts, because facts have to exist. So in other words, existence is presupposed in facts, and facts not presupposed in existence. And therefore, the master key category is existence, and we say therefore the necessary existence is required. Otherwise, nothing would make sense. There would be a contradiction. You wouldn't be able to explain anything. You wouldn't be able to explain the existence of any contingent thing without there ultimately being a necessary existence.
Excellent. So one of the common questions associated, Hamza, there's one of the common questions that's often asked, and I've seen it a few times in the chat, actually scrolling up, is that okay? We can see that everything observable is contingent within the universe, but does that automatically, or is there a way of justifying the claim that therefore the universe itself is contingent? Can you have a set of contingent things where the set itself isn't contingent?
You can have. That's why this is the fallacy of composition.
Okay.
So there's two fallacies. They're informal fallacies. One of them is called the fallacy of composition. The other one's called the fallacy of division, and they're both the opposite of each other. So the fallacy of composition is if one says, "Well, hold on. If you say parts of the elephant are small, therefore the elephant is small."
Yeah.
This is a fallacy. Right, because you're saying the part can be generalized to the whole. It goes actually back to induction in a sense, right? That there is a close connection between the two. But we're not saying that because the part. This is not the argument. That's something which usually people say is a counter to the Kalam cosmological argument, because we say everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe had a cause. They'll ask you, well, with the first premise, and this is one of the counters, actually the counters of Bertrand Russell. He was who popularized the composition fallacy. He said, well, the first thing, everything that begins to exist has a cause. How do you determine that? They'll say, well, you determine that because everything that we can see around us, began to exist. The tree began to exist. I began to exist, right? And so inductively, we say that therefore the universe began to exist because it's under this category of things we call thing, and therefore the universe has a cause. So the problem here is then someone will come back, and this is the most famous and probably the most powerful, to be open about this argument against. They'll say, well, you're saying just because the parts of a thing possess property A, that the thing itself possesses property A. In the famous discussion between Copleston and Bertrand Russell, which actually you can find online, he said it's like saying that just because the individual members of human race have a mother, that must mean that the human race has a mother. He was saying that's a composition fallacy. But once again, it's like saying that just because the elephant is made up of small parts, therefore the elephant is small. This is a composition fallacy. Two responses. Number one, not everything fits the fallacious form. In other words, you can conceive of situations where the part of the thing is in line with the totality of it. So that's the first thing. So for example, we said that the example of the elephant having small parts but being big is fallacious reasoning. But you can have a wall that's made up of red bricks, for example, or blue bricks, and it's blue in its entirety. So it's not necessarily fallacious always. It is a leap you have to make when you're saying everything that begins with has a cause, because we're seeing everything has everything within the thing has a cause. And for that, what I would say is this: a syllogism that's prepared nicely for the universe objection, okay, which is actually I can't attribute it to myself. This is attributed to. And once again, when I quote these guys, I'm not endorsing their theologies. All right, they're all classed as heretics Islamically, but but they have gems, and I just try and extrapolate those gems. I think this was by Al-Farabi, right, which is one of the philosophers before Avicenna, Ibn Sina. So he says this. He says anything that is made up. This is called basically it's an argument from parts, right? Anything that is made out of parts is generated. Okay, so that's premise A. Anything that is made out of parts is generated. The universe is made out of parts. Therefore, the universe is generated. Okay.
Yeah.
So if everything is made out of parts, this is how I would combat this composition first. Anything that is made out of parts is generated. The universe is made out of parts. Therefore, the universe. How do we know that everything that is made out of parts is generated? Because in order for something to exist, if it has parts, it depends upon those parts to be. In other words, if you reassemble them or disassemble them, it will be something else in its entirety. In other words, in order for it to be as it is, it has to have all those parts arranged the way it's arranged, in whatever formulation it is. But it's possible to conceive of a universe that would still be a universe if it didn't have certain members within it. And if you believe in the expanding universe model, which is, let's say for the sake of argument, still the dominant, my understanding, and I'm not a cosmologist, still the dominant cosmology around, though Penrose and co are kind of moving away from that and going to like other models. But even if you, that's another objection, by the way, but then the expanding model is more evidence towards that, because you'll say, well, it's expanding, meaning it's getting bigger. And if it's getting bigger, then once again, what it was yesterday is different to what it is today. And if that is the case, then once again, that shows you that the thing is changing. And for it to change, it contradicts its necessity, it contradicts its eternality, it contradicts so many things, and it's and so on. But the three-stage argument for why the universe can't be the necessary existence is: A, anything that is made out of parts is contingent. It's generated.
Yeah.
The universe is made out of parts, therefore the universe is generated.
Alhamdulillah.
I have one other objection to the Kalam argument, talking about time. saying that time only began when the universe came into existence. So how can you have cause when there's no time? This is one argument I've heard. What's the easiest response to that?
Hamza's also usually gives a thought of experiment where he found from David Hume, where he talks about like conceptually this pillow, and then it's kind of like got an indented.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Have you heard that one? Yeah.
Where someone like sits down on a sofa or something, they create the dent.
Yeah, yeah, press the end, the dent in there. So you can imagine that. But for me, I mean, once again, my contingent or the contingency argument I like to advocate is not something which depends on time at all.
No, I know, but I'm talking about the cause, the kalam, because when you say cause, you're implying there must be some time to do that. For me, it's just there must be some time we're not aware of. I mean, time as we know it may be coming into existence.
So in philosophy, there's two theories. It's A and B theory of time, right? If someone was a proponent, if someone is making the claim that there was no time before, if they say t equals 0, okay, and this is the example that they'll give, they say there was no time within the universe that existed and so on, and therefore what the cause happened had to happen outside of time, or how could it happen outside of time? These kinds of objections. The objection that, or the claim that they're making requires evidence that there was no time. Time equals 0. Because first of all, what we have to understand is what, and this might get a bit complicated now, what is time? Because first of all, in philosophy, and especially in Islamic theology as well, interestingly, there's different conceptions of it. So a nominalist would say, like Ibn Taymiyyah, quite interestingly, he didn't even believe time existed as a category. He said time is just speed. He didn't mention speed over distance, or he didn't mention the physics term, but he just says is events happening, event A and event B, and that which is between the two events. So a nominalist, I could be even more skeptical than the person who's saying that time didn't exist before the universe was created, and say that time still doesn't exist, because universals, categories like time and genuses, basically like, okay, sorry to go back, a genus is basically like a master category. So for example, if I say fatherhood, right, or motherhood doesn't exist. You could argue, right, as a category is only identified by its members. So if I say the idea of horseness, how do we identify what horseness is? We do so through its individual members. So you have horses, like horse 1, horse 2, horse 3. We have horses, right, in the world, right? The quality of horseness is determined by the members of a category. If we got rid of all the horses, would horseness still be there? So the question of do universals exist in the first place is a question that philosophers have been grappling with. For us, we don't necessarily care, to be honest about it, because what is time in its essence? In a physics format, they say speed over distance. Is that correct? Yeah. Speed over distance equals time. T equals what? S over D, right? If from what I remember, I might be incorrect here. But so long as you, and this is the argument from Al-Ghazali actually uses this argument. He says that so long as you believe in time, you have to believe in someone who's moving. Because if you believe in time, you have to believe in someone who's moving, because time indicates movement. Without movement, basically, there is no time. And even physics, it's like that in physics. Because if time equals speed over distance, there has to be some kind of movement going on, right? Otherwise, how can you have speed over? Like, think of this, right? If I have a car and I'm not covering distance with speed, then I'm not moving. Likewise, if there's no events that are happening, there's no time. Okay, so it's begging the question to say, well, time equals 0 before the universe began, because you're trying to say that there was no event that took place before the universe. Did you get what I'm trying to say?
Exactly.
Yeah. So you're trying to say that before the universe, there was. You're making the. If you say there was no time before the universe, what you're saying was that there were no events before the Big Bang. That's what you're saying. And for me, that's begging the question, because remember, we say that what is time? Time is speed over distance, or well, you can even just say, for the sake of argument, movement. Time equals movement, right? For the sake of argument. And for movement to happen, there needs to be events that take place. Event A and event B. And if you say before the universe there was time equals 0, then effectively you're making the claim that there were no events before the universe. And that claim itself requires evidence.
Yeah.
That actually demolishes multiverse. I mean, it demolishes so many things that these physicists are talking about. If you say that there was no such events that took place before the universe, so when they say t equals 0 at the universe, what you're effectively making the claim about is that there were no events that took place pre-Big Bang. And for them to make that claim, they would have to provide the evidence. But then if you reformulate it for them, because remember, time, what is time? Time is just movement. That's all it is.
Yeah.
Fantastic answer. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's kind of what I say, to be honest with you. I just basically say, well, look, something happened, so there must have been some kind of time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think
whether you understand it or not,
this was a problem, man. When I'm jibber jabber waffling and you say it like in one sentence like that.
All right. So I would basically say then, everything we've said so far is just basically demonstrating that we believe, from the argument from contingency, that there must be a necessary being, and that for us is evidence of a creator. Would you not? That's basically what we're saying, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. So what? It depends on what you're talking. Like now, at this point of creator, now they're going to ask, what do you mean by creator?
When I say creator, I just say necessary being. I don't mind.
Yeah, okay. I mean, something. Once again, cause. I think cause is more neutral than creation. But once again, the moment you start saying there's an ultimate cause, then really and truly, it becomes almost a synonym with the word creation, because whatever caused the thing is now. If it's the first thing. It's created it, right? It's brought into existence. It wasn't there before, especially if you believe in ex nihilo, like it happened from nothing.
Yeah, because when I use a Kalam argument, me personally, and I just get to an uncaused cause, then I believe the qualities of this uncaused cause, it must be powerful because it's caused something more powerful than anything we know. It must be intelligent through what it's caused. It must be conscious for choosing to cause. I don't believe all knowing at that stage, but then anything else we learn about. If you want to go into the the attributes of Allah, then that will come through whatever that cause reveals about itself, and that's when we come to religion. But we want to just what I'm happy with for this stream to do today is just to establish that belief that necessary being is a reasonable to believe exists, and this is evidence enough to accept that belief. I think the atheists are in the chat ready to go. There is one atheist I'm not going to invite on, T-Jump, a few reasons. He falls into that category, what you said about the hyper-skepticism, not knowing if you exist, are you a jar in a room or whatever. It's just too hyper-skeptic, for one. For two, I've read comments, I've allowed him to take, because he came on Sabor's stream, mashallah, and I allowed him to take the video clips. And when I read the comments on his channel, he actually says these words. No, I don't really care what they say, just as long as I get the views. So for me, that person's got no integrity. It's so disingenuous, and I'm not going to allow that person to build a platform based on.
So what are you going to tell them to jump out of the chat?
That's it. Because he says a lot of crazy stuff. He says a lot of crazy stuff, but it's so far out there that I don't think it's suitable for what we're doing anyway. And like I said, if someone's not interested in truth, which is what we're doing here. Then go find someone who's like that, but with a speak to Pavlov or something. But so T-Jump,
and that's the bottom line.
It is what it is, right. So the link out there, atheists. You want to jump on? What we'll do, we'll see how the atheists go. And then, inshallah, if you don't mind, we'll invite Muslims to come and ask maybe some Dawah dilemma questions and some things they've got stuck on when they're speaking to atheists. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely, man. I'm happy. We're happy, man.
Okay, we've got a couple lined up already, so I'm going to invite the first one on now. Welcome to the den.
Hi there.
How are you doing? Welcome. Let me just take my little banner off so we can see who you are.
Is that T-Jump?
No, that's Digital Gnosis.
Oh, okay.
Hi. Hi.
So
I'm actually under the power of Satan, and I've been sent here to lead Muslims to hell. Just before we talk or anything, I want you guys to be aware of that. Just so you know, I don't want to be accused of being dishonest or anything.
That's fine.
Yeah, go on, Karen. Good point.
No, that's it.
Oh, that's it. Okay.
Yeah, I just didn't want you to think I was being dishonest or anything, but I'm completely under the power of Satan.
Right, do you have a question?
Well, yeah,
Anything for Simon?
yeah. Well, for example, I got like I can tell you why the argument that was given was wrong, because everything that happens according to Allah's will. There aren't any contingent things to be the first.
What was the argument given?
The argument given would be which of Aquinas's ways is it? Is it the third way of Aquinas or
It's third way, yeah.
Yeah. So there are possible, like you've got to accept Aristotelianism in the first place, right? There are possible things, because he's not using the terms in like the modal sense that like a modern person would put them together. He's using like something that's dependent on itself for its own existence, or dependent on something else for its own existence. So that's that I'm guessing you're going with that one rather than like some kind of modal, like there's things that exist in some possible worlds and all possible worlds, and all possible worlds is a necessary thing. And then you're saying, well, something that depends on something else for its own existence, you can't have an infinite regress of those things, so there must be some necessary things, and then you can't have an infinite regress of necessary things, so there must be some,
Yeah, I think you didn't articulate the argument in the way that I did.
No, probably not.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So long as you're aware of that.
Yeah. I'm just kind of like paraphrasing, but yeah, I don't think that's exactly what you said. To be honest, though, I kind of zoned out for a fair amount of it as well, and I'm also really stupid.
Just so I understand, you paraphrase what you thought you said.
Well, I'm also really stupid as well, because 5 people in the chat have told me how stupid I am, and I just want to say I am really stupid. So that's also why I can't recall what was just.
All right, latest dude. Oh, seriously, come on, man. Sorry, ask questions. You a Muslim?
Agnostic theist, special label.
Can I just say something really brief?
Can I ask you some questions? I don't want to waste time. Like some of these, like in the chat, some of the atheists are embarrassing, to be honest. But yeah, so I wanted to make a comment and actually challenge one of the things you said.
Okay.
So right, so one of the comments that I wanted to make was that, I was reading a book. It's called Britain BC, so Britain Before. And what they do is like they'll go around Stonehenge and they'll see circles arranged. Stones arranged in a circle, and they'll make an assumption and they'll say someone put this way. When you look like a DNA molecule, which is infinitely more complex, how can you say it's random? It's so silly. But that's just one thing I wanted to say. Now, the thing about the contingency argument is that, have you heard of Arthur Penrose's CCC model, where it's in like a cyclical kind of universe kind of thing? So I kind of think that makes a little more sense, because if you think about it, God is also contingent, but on himself. So why can't you have an eternal universe that is contingent on itself in a CCC type model going round? And this would make more sense, I think, because God wouldn't have to create ex nihilo. No, sorry, this universe won't have to create ex nihilo, whereas God does. And you can say it's an argument from ignorance, but isn't everything? Then you could just say that about everything, and they could just say that contingent things can depend on each other.
Okay, yeah, I think there's some interesting interrogations there. I'd like to just kind of put your attention. There's an echoing there. Can you mute?
Sorry, yeah, I'll mute myself.
Sorry. Yeah, so in terms of eternality of the universe, it should be noted that most people who made this argument in the medieval period and classically in the Greek period actually believed they were eternalists. So, for example, Aristotle, he didn't make this argument. He didn't flesh it out, but he was an eternalist, and he did believe in the eternity of the universe. Nevertheless, he did believe in prime mover. In his book, Physics, he elaborates this argument. Avicenna, Al-Farabi, Al-Kindi, and those medieval Muslim scholars, obviously the label that they refer to as Muslim scholars, their theology is shaky from that angle. They were eternalists as well. Okay, so they were making the same argument. So eternality of the universe does not affect the argument, and I'll tell you why. Because you mentioned Roger Penrose's CCC model. I just kind of looked at I think I finished the paper. He recently published a paper talking about this, and he changed his opinion. Penrose. He didn't have this from what I remember, he believed in Big Bang cosmology, and then he kind of changed his view quite recently. I think in the last 5 or 10 years. I can't remember when it was. But putting that to the side, whether he believes in eternal universe or not, the question is as follows: is the universe dependent or independent? If the universe, so let me ask that question to you: is the universe, in your understanding, is it dependent, is it contingent, or is it independent and necessary? Which one would you choose from the two?
Can you hear me? Is there an echo?
No, it's good now. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. No, definitely the universe is definitely dependent, like in every way, in terms of like beginning, time, space, location, everything about it is dependent. And like you said, one of the fact that it's expanding, and so it has to be dependent on something else. But my point is, what if there's a time outside? So what if it's cyclical? Although cyclical is still contingent. Like a lot of atheists will say, "Oh well, I solved it by making it into a circle." A circle is still infinity. It's still contingent. It's in like a circle. But my point is that what if it's